RuneScape just announced sweeping nerfs to the common loot of a ton of bosses, including Zamorak, Glacier, Karapak, Zuk, Wilderness Flash Events, and Raksha. So in this video, let's go over the changes, the rationale behind the changes, and then we're gonna have a microeconomics lesson because while one of the reasonings for these nerfs is by all estimations pretty good and pretty fair, the other might actually not be the right direction for RuneScape, the players, or the economy. Get your notebooks out, there will be a quiz on this later. For starters, RuneScape dropped this news post a couple days ago outlining some upcoming content, and alongside that there's a section that is ominously titled Game Health Update, wherein detailed that a number of nerfs to common loot tables are announced. This announcement is also an announcement of an announcement because more details will be given before these nerfs hit on May the 12th. The reasoning behind these nerfs is twofold. They aren't trying to do just one thing with these nerfs, they're trying to do two separate, distinct things. But in doing so, they might be hitting PVMers harder than they need to and for limited benefit. So let's get into it. The first reason given is inflation, as the sheer number of alchables given from the Elder God Wars dungeon is quite frankly insane, and this is one I can actually get behind. As much as it's 3 years late, anyone who's ventured into the Elder God Wars dungeon knows how quite frankly overpowered the alchables are from every boss, both in normal and hard modes. It's to the point that there's virtually no point trying to gather raw GP from anywhere else, as the Elder God Wars is the best alchables in the game at every level bracket and every combat skill level. There aren't any perfect inflation markers in RuneScape, but many players will look at the price of bonds to give you a rough idea. This isn't perfect because the usefulness of bonds does vary over time, which will impact the price. And because of this, you can't say definitively that the price increase is a result of inflation, but if you were to use them to give yourself a rough idea, you would find that in July of 2021, when Elder God Wars was released, a bond was just under 30 million coins. And 4 years later, that same bond is a whopping 140 million GP. If Jagex is going to say that the main cause of inflation in the game is Elder God Wars, I'm going to believe them and say that an alchables nerf is probably a good and smart idea, even if it's years too late. But not dissimilar to smacking a player with a DDS special attack, PVMers are getting hit twice here, as further down it's also listed that there will be a reduction in skilling supplies from these drop tables as well, as a means to improve skilling profitability. And this is a thing that I don't think we need, and I'm going to explain why. This is a standard market equilibrium curve. The axes are price and quantity of goods, with the demand curve listed as D0 and the supply curve as S0. Where these lines intersect is what we would call the market equilibrium, or the meeting of demand and supply, resulting in the price of the item and the quantity of the item that is being sold. You can imagine this as capturing any skilling supply item individually or an aggregation of any skilling supply that is also on a PVM drop table. And marked in red here, I'm going to mark where the market equilibrium is. It's going to be right there. What's being suggested in this news post is that in order to raise the price, you need to lower the supply. And you'll see here if we draw a new supply curve in red that I'm going to call S1, you're going to shift that supply curve to the left. And you'll see here that the price will increase in your new market equilibrium if you do this. If you choke the supply, the price will go up, which makes sense. The other effect of this is there will be fewer skilling supplies on PVM drop tables, which will be probably not so good for irons and not great for PVMers either, but it will increase the price. This effect will be felt most strongly initially, but over time prices could increase to the point that it isn't quite as impactful from a GP per hour standpoint. With that said, it's unlikely the prices ever recover to the point that the GP per hour is equal to what it is today, because these nerf supplies are not solely generated from the bosses that are being nerfed. To say that a different way, if a particular item comes into the game from Slayer, a minigame, 4 bosses, and 2 skilling activities, nerfing the quantity of that item from 2 bosses by 30% isn't going to raise the price of the item by 30%, not even close. And your end result is just going to be a reduction of GP per hour at those 2 bosses that, as we talked about earlier in the video, already had their alchables taken away. But here's my problem. I would make the argument that this isn't really a supply issue at all. It's actually a demand issue. Because while supply is a lot easier to nerf, here are just some of the factors that influence the diminishing demand of skilling supplies. You've got bonus XP, event loot boxes, treasure hunter spins, daily challenges, double XP weekend, and possibly one of the worst offenders of all time, proteins. Each of these things reduce the need for a player to buy any or as many skilling supplies, as they now have ways to train their skills without interacting with the skilling economy whatsoever. In this sense, it's possible to have the exact same effect of higher prices without hurting PVMers or Iron Man by making meaningful changes to any or all of those aforementioned systems. This is just an example and not like an actual pitch, but imagine if instead of giving players proteins and protein processors, you gave them an item that allowed them to use skilling supplies faster, granting accelerated experience rates. In doing this, all of a sudden, you're still selling experience and a boost to progression, but without operating outside of the skilling economy. And all of a sudden, you've created an increased demand for skilling supplies. And what that will look like, I'll do in orange here, it's going to be a new demand curve that is going to shift to the right. We'll call this one D1. And you'll see here in this new market equilibrium, what you've done is you've actually raised the price the exact same way as nerfing PVM drops, but this time around, you've done it on the demand side. So your new equilibrium is right here in orange. At the same time as doing this, what if you also swapped daily challenges from direct XP to bonus XP? Players probably wouldn't like this change, but in doing so, all of a sudden, you've encouraged players to interact with the skilling economy by not providing direct experience. They'll still get a massive boost to progression, but without the same negative impact on demand. If you were to do that, you might shift the demand curve even further to the right and make something like what I've done right here in blue. All of a sudden now, if you're intersecting the initial supply curve or the original supply curve with demand 2, all of a sudden, look what we've done here. We have now raised the price even further of these skilling supplies, which is the ultimate goal of this, while also not impacting or nerfing PVMers or irons whatsoever. The main point I'm trying to make here is that this change, whether it's communicated as necessary or not, isn't actually necessary at all. It's just the easiest, lowest hanging fruit that doesn't require the asking of uncomfortable questions, like how did we get into this position in the first place? And I'd feel a heck of a lot better about these changes if they were willing to not just look at the supply side of the coin. There's a line in the news post that states, "This is not a one-time change, but part of a continuous initiative. We're actively assessing the economic impact of various systems and making adjustments to support long-term sustainability and overall game health." So all I have to say is this. I'll believe it when I see it, but you might want to look at the demand side of the curve. You may be able to get the same or even an amplified effect on the economy without hurting players, and considering nerfing select loot tables only impacts part of the supply line as these drops all come into the game via other means as well, it would be reasonable to expect that not only would it be less disruptive to players to make a change on the demand side, but a change like this would also be more effective in increasing the price of skilling items. And you can do all that without telling every player who's done a boss in the Elder God Wars dungeon in the last 4 years that now, when they do the same boss they've always done, they're gonna get less loot for the same effort, which isn't the most player-first approach if you ask me. There's also a version of this where you actually add more skilling supplies to PVM drop tables in order to offset the loss of alchables while further increasing demand to accommodate that. It's probably a topic for a different video, but you could end up with something like this, with your new supply curve there, and then your new demand curve going all the way here. In doing so, you can actually increase the price while also increasing the amount of loot that PVMers are getting in order to offset the loss of alchables, which, like we talked about, is actually probably a really good change and something I'm in favor of. This would obviously be a much more hands-on and a much more dynamic approach, and I'm not suggesting that this needs to be done, but I'd certainly like to see some changes being made on both sides of the coin. I also wanted to mention that this video was reviewed by an economist, because I haven't studied econ in a good few years, and I wanted to make sure that the information supplied was at least reasonable. On my idea of impacting both supply and demand at the same time, he suggested that it may actually make more sense to make both changes one at a time as a means to more accurately track the data on the impacts of each change separately. As with anything, if you change two variables at the same time, it's always hard to tell which variable is the catalyst. Either way though, it's just an example of how things could be handled, whether that's all at once or two changes in succession. But with all that said, thank you for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below, and I'll see you next week for the quiz.